By midnight, the storm had turned the abandoned industrial property into a maze of rain, darkness, and rust. Elias Vale moved through it with a flashlight in one hand and a battered backpack in the other, searching for anything worth selling. A copper white, an old machine part, anything that might buy him another week before the landlord changed the locks. He had no degree, no powerful friends, and no one waiting to rescue him. Only debt, only exhaustion, and the growing fear that, by morning, even the small life he had left would be gone. Inside the condemned facility, wind screamed through broken windows as Elias stepped over fallen beams and piles of soaked insulation. The air smelled of mold, oil, and something metallic beneath the dust. Then his flashlight caught a shape behind a collapsed section of wall. A steel door. It was almost completely hidden beneath concrete and debris. Rust had consumed its edges, but one faded warning remained visible. Authorized personnel only project synthesis. Elias stared at the words. He should have walked away. Instead, he found a length of pipe and began striking the lock. The first blow echoed through the building. The second made something inside groan. On the seventh, the door finally opened. Beyond it was a laboratory frozen in time. Dust covered rows of glass containers. Machines stood silent beneath plastic sheets. A computer monitor sat black and lifeless against the far wall. Elias stepped inside. The door slammed shut behind him. Then, somewhere in the darkness, a machine clicked. A low electrical hum followed. The dead computer flickered. Elias froze. Across the screen, white letters appeared one by one. If you are reading this, they failed to find it. For several seconds, Elias could only hear the rain pounding against the roof. Then another question appeared. Who? He took one slow step toward the screen. And beneath that word, a final message began to load. Something had been hidden here. 3 weeks earlier, Elias Vale had been counting coins on a kitchen table that was barely standing. The apartment around him had once been painted white. Now the walls were the color of old smoke, and rainwater had left dark stains beneath the windows. The refrigerator hummed without cooling properly. On the table, beside a broken radio, lay a final notice from his landlord. Elias looked at the paper, then at the coins. There was not enough. There had not been enough for months. He repaired discarded electronics because people threw away things they considered useless. Old televisions, damaged phones, computers with cracked screens. Elias could usually make them work again, but nobody paid much for things they had already decided were worthless. That was how most people saw him too. A man who had never quite become anything. He had been passed over for better jobs, ignored by people with connections, and forgotten by employers who promised to call. He was clever enough to solve problems, but never important enough to receive credit. So when he heard about the condemned industrial property, Elias did not see mystery. He saw opportunity. Old facilities often contained copper, machinery, tools, and equipment that could be sold. If he was lucky, one night inside could mean enough money to keep his apartment for another month. That was all he wanted. Survival. He had no idea that, behind a collapsed wall, he was about to discover something more valuable than anything he had ever touched. Something hidden from the world. Something connected to a name he remembered from an old newspaper article. Dr. Adrian Voss. A scientist once called a fraud. A man who had vanished. And now, inside a forgotten laboratory, Elias was standing where Voss had once worked. For the first time in his life, the man nobody expected to matter had found something that mattered to everyone. By dawn, Elias had stopped thinking about the money. He sat beneath the weak glow of his apartment lamp, surrounded by newspaper clippings, old digital archives, and the name Adrian Voss written across a sheet of paper. The story had begun decades earlier. Voss had claimed he was developing a synthetic treatment for a disease that had destroyed thousands of lives. His compound was designed to imitate a natural biological process without depending on scarce materials that made conventional treatments expensive and difficult to produce. The idea had been revolutionary. The response had been immediate. The scientific community rejected him. Investors withdrew. Newspapers called the research incomplete, irresponsible, and ultimately unsuccessful. Then Adrian Voss disappeared. Elias read article after article. And slowly, something began to bother him. Every major report used the same phrase. The research was unsuccessful. Not similar wording. The exact same wording. Again and again. Elias leaned back in his chair. People did not usually describe failure with identical language unless someone had given them the words. He returned to the laboratory. Among the dust-covered equipment, he found a stack of photographs hidden inside a damaged cabinet. There was Voss, younger than Elias had imagined, standing beside a team of researchers. 5 people, not one. Yet every official record described the project as if Voss had worked alone. Elias studied the faces until one name caught his attention. Dr. Miriam Cross. Her name appeared nowhere in the articles. Nowhere in the public records. Nowhere in the history of the project. Then Elias noticed something beneath an old laboratory desk. Someone had scratched words into the wood. Miriam Cross. He crouched closer. Below her name, another message had been carved into the desk. The cure was never the failure. Elias stared at the words. Outside, morning traffic began moving through the city. Inside the forgotten laboratory, the past had just contradicted everything the world believed. And suddenly, the question was no longer why Adrian Voss had disappeared. It was what happened to everyone who knew the truth. Elias spent the next several hours searching the laboratory with the patience of someone who had learned never to trust an empty room. The obvious files were gone. Computer drives had been smashed. Cabinets stood open and bare. Most of the equipment had been removed, leaving only dust-shaped outlines where machines had once stood. Someone had not simply abandoned this place. Someone had cleaned it, but not perfectly. Near the back of the laboratory, Elias noticed a section of flooring that sounded different beneath his footsteps. He knelt and pried at the panel. It lifted. Beneath it was a narrow compartment covered in dust. Inside were old research journals, several damaged storage drives, and a sealed metal case. Elias carried the case to the nearest table. The lock was already broken. Inside, beneath layers of brittle paper, he found a document marked Synthetic Compound, Final Iteration. His hands tightened around the pages. The formula was there, but it was incomplete. Several pages had been removed with deliberate precision. Not torn, removed. Elias stared at the empty spaces. Had someone stolen them, destroyed them, or hidden them somewhere else? Then he found a small recording device beneath the papers. The screen flickered when he pressed the button. Dr. Adrian Voss appeared. His face was pale. His eyes were bloodshot. He looked like a man who had not slept in days. "The compound works," Voss said. Elias stopped breathing, but not in the way they expected. Voss glanced away from the camera. "They believe the value is in controlling the treatment. They are wrong. The real danger is that." The recording crackled. Voss suddenly looked toward something outside the frame. Then the screen went black. Elias stood alone in the silent laboratory. The evidence was no longer pointing toward abandonment. It was pointing toward erasure. Someone had entered this place, destroyed the research, removed the missing formula, and tried to make the world believe Adrian Voss had simply failed. But if the compound worked, Elias wondered, why had someone gone to such extraordinary lengths to make sure nobody ever found out? The following night, Elias returned to the laboratory. He told himself it was because he had forgotten something. He knew that was a lie. The truth was that the place had begun to occupy his thoughts. The hidden formula, the missing pages, Adrian Voss's frightened face. Elias needed answers. But when he reached the building, he stopped beneath the rain. The steel door was locked. He had forced it open the night before. Now the damaged lock had been replaced. Elias slowly turned toward the window he had broken. The glass was gone. A new pane had been installed. Someone had been there. He entered through another opening and hurried to the laboratory. The notebook was gone. The sealed metal case remained on the table, but one page had been removed. Only one. Elias stood perfectly still. His mouth went dry. Whoever had entered had known exactly what to take. He suddenly became aware of everything he did not have. No money. No lawyer. No powerful friends. No idea who he was dealing with. He was just Elias Vale, a man who repaired broken electronics and had accidentally opened a door that powerful people had spent decades trying to keep closed. Then he noticed the vehicle. Across the street, beneath a flickering lamp, a dark sedan sat with its engine running. It remained there for hours. Elias watched from behind a broken window. Finally, he stepped outside. The sedan's headlights came on. Before Elias could reach it, the vehicle pulled away and vanished into the rain. The next morning, his phone vibrated. There was no name attached to the message. Only 6 words. "You found something buried for a reason." Elias read it twice. Then a second message appeared. "You are not the only one looking." He stared at the screen as cold spread through his chest. The laboratory had been forgotten for decades. But now that Elias had opened its door, someone else had begun searching too. And whatever was hidden inside might not remain hidden much longer. Elias found Mara Cross after 3 days of searching. She lived alone in a narrow house at the edge of the city, behind a fence covered in rust and climbing vines. When she opened the door, Elias barely had time to say her mother's name before Mara tried to close it again. "My mother is dead," she said. "I know. Then you know there's nothing to discuss." Elias held up his phone. The message from the laboratory was still on the screen. "You found something buried for a reason." Mara's expression changed. Not dramatically. Just enough for Elias to realize she had seen those words before. She opened the door. Inside, the house smelled of old books and dust. Photographs covered the walls, but most had been turned face down. Mara told him her mother had died believing her life's work had been stolen. For decades, Miriam Cross had insisted the synthetic treatment was real. Not perfect, not finished, but real. The project had not been abandoned because the science failed. It had been abandoned because the science threatened people who had invested too much money in failure. The treatment could be manufactured cheaply. If perfected, it could make existing treatments dramatically less valuable. A cure that could save thousands of lives could also destroy billions in profit. Elias looked at the photographs. "Why didn't your mother expose them?" Mara gave a bitter smile. "She tried." Then she walked to a cabinet and removed a small box. Inside were letters, newspaper clippings, and a photograph of Miriam standing beside Adrian Voss. "There was one thing my mother never told anyone," Mara said. Elias looked up. The missing part of the formula was hidden outside the laboratory. "Where?" Mara shook her head. "She never told me." For a moment, neither spoke. Then Mara looked toward the photograph. "My mother said the truth was safer when nobody knew where it was." Elias thought about the message on his phone. Someone had already found the laboratory. Someone was watching him. And somewhere beyond those walls, the missing piece of a cure that could change everything was still waiting to be found. Mara followed Elias back to the laboratory the next evening. Neither of them spoke much on the way. There was too much they did not know, and too much they had already begun to fear. Inside, they searched the remaining equipment one machine at a time. Most were useless, rusted, dead, stripped of anything valuable. Then Elias noticed a number. A long sequence stamped into the side of an old processing unit. He had seen it before. In Adrian Voss's notebook. The same sequence appeared repeatedly beside notes Elias had initially dismissed as technical references. He turned to Mara. This machine mattered. Together, they searched it. Behind a panel that appeared welded shut, Elias discovered a hidden compartment. Inside was a narrow metal cylinder. And inside the cylinder, protected from moisture and time, was an old microfilm reel. They found a projector in another room. When the image finally appeared, Elias expected research data. Instead, a map filled the wall. Not a map of the laboratory. Not a map of the city. It showed an abandoned hospital. Beneath it was a network of underground corridors. Mara stepped closer. "What is that?" Elias studied the markings. A medical facility. Hidden beneath the hospital. A place that no longer appeared on modern records. Then he noticed a date printed along the edge of the map. 7 days from now. The facility was scheduled for demolition. Elias looked at Mara. If the research is still there, it could be destroyed. Neither of them finished the thought. For decades, The missing formula had survived because no one knew where it was. Now, they had a map, and only 7 days to reach it. But the final image on the microfilm made Elias's stomach tighten. Near the hospital entrance, someone had drawn a small black circle. Beside it was a single word: watched. Mara looked toward the dark windows. Elias suddenly understood. They were no longer the only people searching for the cure. The abandoned hospital stood beyond the city limits, its windows dark and its walls stained by decades of rain. Elias and Mara began searching through public records, old property files, and financial documents. What they found changed everything. The original research project had not been funded by a small private group. It had been secretly financed by a pharmaceutical company that would later become one of the most powerful medical corporations in the country. Officially, the project had ended because Adrian Voss failed. But the financial records told a different story. Years after Voss disappeared, the company acquired patents for another treatment designed for the same disease. That treatment became enormously profitable. The executives who had declared Voss's research worthless eventually became wealthy selling something that solved the same problem. Elias stared at the documents. So, they didn't just lose the cure. Mara looked at him. Maybe they never wanted it released. The mystery had become something darker. The cure might not have been hidden by one person. It might have been buried by an entire system. Then Mara found something her mother had never mentioned. A legal complaint, filed shortly before Miriam Cross disappeared from public life. The complaint accused the company of suppressing research and manipulating scientific records. But the case had never been investigated. It had simply vanished. Mara read the witness list. Then she stopped breathing. One name was still alive: Samuel Reed, a former technician from the original laboratory. A man who had worked beside Voss and Miriam before the project collapsed. Elias looked at Mara. Where is he? She folded the document carefully. I don't know. Then she turned the page over. Written on the back was an address. For a moment, neither of them moved. Outside, the abandoned hospital stood in silence. Somewhere beneath its foundations, the missing research might still be waiting. But now Elias understood something terrifying. The people who had buried the past had not all disappeared. Some of them might still be alive. And one of them knew exactly what had happened. Samuel Reed lived alone in a house surrounded by dead grass and rusted machinery. When Elias and Mara arrived, he watched them through a narrow window but refused to open the door. I don't know anything, he said. Elias held up the research notes. Samuel saw them. And suddenly, the old man's face changed. He opened the door. Inside, the house smelled of dust, cold coffee, and something burned. Samuel studied the pages for a long time. Then he whispered, "They found it." Elias felt his chest tighten. Samuel explained that the synthetic compound had worked. Not perfectly, but enough to prove the research was viable. The problem was the final stabilization process. It was so inexpensive that the company considered it impossible to patent profitably. The treatment could be produced for a fraction of the cost of existing alternatives. That was the real threat. The research had been scheduled for public release. Then, days before the announcement, everything changed. The project was shut down. Adrian Voss disappeared. Miriam Cross was threatened. And the research was divided and hidden. Samuel looked toward the window. I kept one piece. He gave Elias an address, the location of the missing data. Before they could leave, glass exploded behind them. Mara screamed. Samuel dropped to the floor as something struck the wall above his head. Elias pulled Mara down. Another impact shook the house. Someone was outside. Someone had come for Samuel. And now they knew exactly where Elias and Mara were. Samuel pointed toward a rear door. Go! They ran through the darkness as another shot shattered the window behind them. By the time they reached the road, the house was silent. Elias looked back. The old witness had been terrified for decades. Now he had finally spoken. And whoever had been waiting for him to do so had just made it clear that the truth was no longer merely dangerous. It was worth killing for. They escaped through the trees with only a handful of Samuel's documents. Behind them, his house burned. The flames climbed through the windows, consuming decades of evidence in minutes. Elias kept running until pain exploded through his shoulder. He stumbled. Mara caught him before he hit the ground. A piece of shattered glass had cut deep into his arm. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The archive was gone. Samuel was gone. And the people hunting them had shown exactly how far they were willing to go. Elias pressed a hand against the wound. Only hours earlier, he had been searching an abandoned building for scrap metal he could sell. Now he was being hunted because he had found something that could change the world. There was no returning to his old life. Mara drove through the darkness toward the abandoned hospital. The demolition was only days away. Then, finally, she told him the truth she had kept hidden. Years earlier, her mother had been offered a deal. Money, protection, a chance to sell the research and disappear quietly. Miriam refused. The decision destroyed her career. It isolated her family. And eventually, it cost her the life she had built. Elias stared through the windshield as the road disappeared beneath the headlights. She could have been rich, he said. Mara shook her head. She believed some things were too important to sell. For the first time, Elias understood what they were really chasing. It was not simply a formula. It was the sacrifice of people who had lost everything rather than surrender the truth. Ahead, the abandoned hospital appeared through the darkness. Its broken windows reflected the moonlight. Beneath it, hidden beneath concrete and years of silence, the missing research might still exist. But the demolition crews would arrive soon. And if Elias and Mara failed to reach it in time, the final piece of the cure could disappear forever. They entered the hospital through a service tunnel buried beneath a collapsed loading dock. The air below was cold and wet. Water covered the floor in places, reflecting the weak beams of their flashlights. Abandoned medical equipment stood along the walls, its metal surfaces furred with rust. Every step carried them deeper into the darkness. At the end of the corridor, they found a steel door. The same symbol appeared on it. Project Synthesis. Mara pushed it open. Inside, most of the archive had been destroyed. Shelves were empty. Files had been ripped away. But at the center of the room stood one sealed metal cabinet. It had never been opened. Elias forced the lock. Inside was everything. The complete research record, the original test results, and the final formula. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Elias found the recordings. The first showed Adrian Voss. He looked older than the man in the laboratory message. Tired, but calm. The truth was not what Elias expected. Voss had not been killed. He had not been imprisoned. He had vanished willingly. He had discovered that the company planned to release a deliberately weakened version of the treatment while keeping the true formula hidden. So Voss had done the only thing he believed could protect it. He disappeared, and he took the truth with him. But the final recording revealed something even stranger. The formula had never been incomplete. The missing pages were not missing at all. They were a key. The research data itself had been encrypted. Elias suddenly remembered the sequence from the old machine. The numbers repeated throughout Voss's notebook. They were not references. They were instructions. The formula he had found in the laboratory had been waiting for the correct key all along. Mara stared at the documents. Then Elias noticed a name connected to the encryption. Miriam Cross. Her mother had carried the key for decades without knowing what it truly was. The woman who had protected the research had unknowingly carried the final piece of the cure with her. Mara's hands began to tremble. Elias looked toward the archive. Above them, the world was preparing to destroy the hospital. Below them, they had finally found what everyone else had failed to erase. The cure had survived. But now that they had uncovered it, the people who had buried it would know the truth was no longer hidden. Mara found the letter inside the lining of her mother's old box. The paper was yellowed and fragile, covered in handwriting she had seen thousands of times. At the bottom was a sequence of numbers. Elias entered it into the research archive. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then the damaged screen began filling with data. The encrypted formula unfolded before them. The complete synthetic compound. Elias stared at the results. It was viable. Not a miracle. Not something that could be placed in a bottle and distributed overnight. It still required testing, validation, and legal approval. but the science was real, and the potential cost of producing the treatment was dramatically lower than existing alternatives. Mara looked at Elias. We could sell it. For the first time, he imagined what that might mean. Money, security, a home no one could take from him, a life where he would never again count coins beneath a broken lamp. But then he looked at the names in the archive. Voss, Miriam, Samuel, people who had sacrificed everything to keep the truth alive. Before they could decide, a notification appeared on the computer. A legal claim had already been filed. The corporation was asserting ownership of the research. They had discovered the archive, and they were coming for it. Within hours, lawyers arrived at the hospital with court documents. The company had money, influence, political connections, and an army of attorneys. Elias had none of those things. He was the man nobody had expected to matter. Now he stood in a dark underground archive holding evidence powerful enough to threaten an entire industry. Mara looked at the legal papers. They're going to take it. Elias looked at the formula. Then he thought about the door he had opened. The warning. The hidden laboratory. The people who had spent decades trying to erase the truth. He had entered that place searching for something valuable enough to sell. Now, he understood the real question. Was the cure worth more in the hands of the person who owned it, or in the hands of everyone who needed it? Above them, the corporation was closing in. And for the first time, Elias was no longer running from poverty. He was standing against power itself. Elias made the decision nobody expected. He would not sell the research privately. Instead, he released everything. The original records, the suppressed correspondence, the laboratory photographs, the witness statements, the evidence proving the project had never simply failed. Within hours, journalists began publishing the story. The forgotten laboratory became national news. The corporation responded immediately. They called Elias a trespasser, a fraud, a desperate man looking for attention. Their lawyers claimed the research belonged to the company. But the evidence kept growing. The original documents were authenticated. Independent researchers confirmed the scientific records. Surviving witnesses came forward. The timeline became impossible to deny. Adrian Voss had worked on the treatment. Miriam Cross had helped develop it. The project had been shut down. The research had been hidden. And the company had later profited from a different treatment for the same disease. The story was no longer one man's accusation. It was a documented history. The legal battle began. The corporation demanded ownership of the research. Mara fought for recognition of her mother's work. Elias faced charges connected to entering the abandoned facility. The same man who had once been ignored by employers now stood in court against lawyers representing one of the most powerful corporations in the country. He had no fortune, no political influence, no powerful family behind him. But something had changed. People were listening. Every attempt to silence the story created more attention. Every accusation against Elias brought new questions. Why had the company waited decades to claim the research? Why had the original scientists been erased? Why had the evidence been hidden? The corporation could control lawyers. It could control headlines. But it could no longer control the truth. And as the case moved forward, the forgotten laboratory became impossible to suppress. The door Elias had opened in darkness had finally opened before the entire world. The corporation eventually acknowledged the original research. The legal dispute ended with a settlement, but the truth could no longer be buried. The synthetic treatment still required proper scientific testing and regulatory approval. There were no instant miracles.
No burnout transformation.
But the research was finally where it belonged, in the hands of people willing to examine it openly. The families of the original researchers received recognition. Miriam Cross's name was restored to the history of the project. For Mara, that mattered more than money. Her mother had spent decades believing the world had forgotten her. Now the world finally knew what she had protected. Elias did not become a billionaire. He did not move into a mansion or become the owner of a medical empire. Instead, he became something unexpected. The guardian of a story powerful people had tried to erase. Years later, the abandoned laboratory was transformed into a research center dedicated to affordable medical innovation. The same place, once used to hide the truth, became a place where researchers were encouraged to share it. One evening, Elias stood before the old steel door. The warning had been removed. In its place was a simple plaque. Some discoveries are forgotten because they are worthless. Others are forgotten because they are worth too much. Elias ran his fingers across the words. He remembered the man he had been that night.
Broke. Ignored.
Desperate enough to search an abandoned building for anything he could sell. He had entered that laboratory believing he was looking for something valuable. Instead, he had found something priceless. Not just a cure, a truth, a history, a promise kept by people who had sacrificed everything to protect it. And standing before that door, Elias finally understood the strangest part of the entire story. The world had told him he was insignificant. But sometimes, the person nobody expects to matter is the only person willing to open the door everyone else was too afraid to touch.